honor to be here sharing this very special occasion with my dearest friend, Sandy. And it's truly a special moment for us, both of us. Our friendship goes back, way back, and I'll tell you some of that story here. Truly a special occasion. Sor Juana de Inés de la Cruz, Machado de Asís, Jorge Luis Borges, Rodolfo Usigli, Javier Villaurrutia, Celestino Gorostiza, Salvador Novo, Octavio Paz, Elena Garro, Rosario Castellanos, Emilio Carballido, Griselda Gambaro, Carlos Fuentes, Mirna Casas, Sabina Berman are only some of the names of distinguished Spanish-American writers that immediately surface when we examine the academic trajectory of Professor and friend Sandra Messinger's Cypess, from now on Sandy. A trajectory that clearly leads to the recent publication of her book on civil wars, Elena Garro, Octavio Paz, and the Battle of Cultural Memory, 2012. In addition to being published in the prestigious University of Texas Press on Civil Wars, has received honorable mention under the category of Media and Cultural Studies by the American Publisher Awards for Professional and Scholarly Excellence. As you certainly notice, the impressive repertory of writers I just mentioned hails from all parts of the continent, from Mexico, the Caribbean, and the Southern Cone, from diverse periods, colonial times, the 19th century, the avant-garde, contemporary writers, and from all genres, as Sandy moves with ease from the study of Spanish-American poetry to theater to narrative. Sandy has contributed as well to Sephardic and Jewish studies and has produced a body of influential work on feminist and female writers. Her landmark book, La Malinche in Mexican Literature, is a clear example of the depth and breadth I have just alluded to, as she traces the historical and mythical figure of La Malinche through Mexican literature, from Bernal Diaz's account of Malitzin's role in the conquest of the Aztec Empire to the Chicana writer's reformulation of Malinche's tradition in the 20th century. I venture to suggest that it is in the pages of this book on La Malinche where we find the seeds of Sandy's on civil wars. Beyond recognizing Sandy's significant contribution to the study of distinguished writers and diverse topics in the field of Spanish-American literature, I wish to underscore once again her pioneering role in the study of women writers and feminism. Her devotion to this area of study, which touches on the personal and the political, opened the way for many of us as we traveled in her footsteps, as we were enriched by her research. It was precisely as I was reading Sandy's 1985 essay on Rosario Castellanos' Balún Canán that I was inspired to also write about this novel. I remember vividly that while writing my article on Castellanos' text, I felt that I was actually conversing, talking, chatting with Sandy, learning from her, even arguing with her about some aspects of the novel. I cherish that memory as a unique and wonderful one, knowing that through our writings, we are talking to each other, we are sharing ideas, growing, discussing our various points of view. As part of this debt, my debt to her, in 2009, I dedicated to Sandy my essay, Sacra Escritura y Secreta Oralidad en el Nombre de Dios de Sabina Berman. Years before, she had written the best essay on Berman's En el Nombre de Dios, initially titled Herejía, a play devoted to the powerful historical events in 16th century Mexico and the Inquisition's trials of Luis de Carvajal and his crypto-Jewish family. As I was researching the topic, I consulted with Sandy about Jewish traditions, and she kindly guided me through them. Sandy's key role within Latin American women's studies and her generosity has not been overlooked. Just some weeks ago, Sandy was selected by the University of Maryland's Women's Studies Honor Society, Triota, as the recipient of the 2012-2013 Award for Feminist Excellence. And they granted this award, and I quote, "based on your pioneering work in the study of women writers of Latin America, your commitment to teaching and mentoring women, students, and colleagues, and your overall embodiment of feminist values and ideals," end of quote. These statements perfectly summarize Sandy's qualities as a scholar, teacher, mentor, and human being. Several years ago, I had the honor of reading Sandy's manuscript on civil wars, Elena Garro, Octavio Paz, and the battle for cultural memory. It had another title then. Today, it is not any longer a manuscript. It is not a work in progress. It is instead a magnificent study published by a major university press. As the reader is about to open this book, she, the reader, we, is struck by the image in its cover of two fountain pens forming an X-shaped pens with the appearance of revolutionary rifles and entangled by a ribbon that interweaves the personal, the cultural, and the political of two Mexican literary icons, Elena Garro, 1916-1998, and Octavio Paz, 1914-1998. That is, the book's goal to introduce the work of Garro to a greater audience and to underscore her role as an intellectual and as a creative influence on Mexican culture is achieved in a unique way by establishing a fascinating dialogue, some would call it battle, between Garro's literary production and personal life and the literary production and personal life of her well-known ex-husband and Nobel laureate, Octavio Paz. I assure you that Sandy is a woman of peace. But her decision to use war as a leitmotif in her book is extremely pertinent, since she portrays in literal and metaphorical ways the historical, political, and personal struggles in which both Garro and Paz were involved during their time together and then through their separate and complex lives. They both cared and wrote about very conflicted events in Mexican and European history, such as the conquest, the Mexican Revolution, the Spanish Civil War, and the events in Tlatelolco, allowing Sandy not only to discuss these events, but to examine the so-called battle of the sexes, both inside and outside Mexico, symbolized in Paz and Garros' relationship. Although critics have written extensively about Paz's work and influence in literary and cultural circles, and although others have begun publishing essays and books since the 1980s about the works of Elena Garro, not much has been done in an exhaustive manner to contrastively examine their works and ideas. In order to lead the reader into the complex world of Garro, Cypess weaves an impressive tapestry that analyzes the documentation already published about Garro and Paz, and then offers the reader in-depth analysis of their contrasting ideological and political positions as expressed in their works. She offers both a panoramic view of their lives and a trenchant analysis of works that Sandy correctly sees as representative of different moments, circumstances, and views of the world around them. Let me just underscore one instance where we see in motion this comparative approach and how it sheds light on the patriarchal hegemony in Mexican letters and culture. In On Civil Wars, Sandy carefully examines Garro and Paz's understanding of the figure of La Malinche. The fact that Paz is inevitably quoted whenever Malitzin is discussed as a historical figure, as woman, traitor, translator, lover, and mother, invites Cypess Sandy to explore why Paz's sometimes inaccurate and prejudiced views of this character has been so easily disseminated, but not those of Garro, who in her 1963 novel Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, Recollections of Things to Come, examines more in depth the complex concept of Malinchismo. But beyond understanding Garros' marginal position in a culture described as machista, Sandy reminds the reader that Garros' main goal through her literature is not only to tell her side of the story, but to explore the process of representation of women in texts and by extension in reality. In other words, through the study of novels, plays, and memoirs in the case of Garro, and through essays and poems in the case of Paz, Sandy sagaciously explored Mexican literature, history, and culture in the context of the tumultuous relationship between a woman and a man who were each controversial in their own way, and whose social, literary, and political stance placed them in a very different ideological and personal positions. Paz in a privileged place as a writer and cultural icon, and Garro in the realm of the marginal, where her literature has been less frequently read because of outside pressures and stigmas, some of them related to her ex-husband. Through the comparative approach, Sandy not only attempts to underscore Garro and Paz's literary productions, to elucidate their respective cultural readings of crucial events from the conquest to modern times, but also to underscore how much harder it was for even a brilliant woman to be heard, to write, and to disagree with the male establishment. For Sandy, events such as the Spanish Civil War or the massacre of Tlatelolco closely touched Garro and Paz's writings, but left very different marks in their personal lives and in the way they were perceived by the reading audience. Most importantly, when Sandy examines some of Garros' texts that have been identified as autobiographical because they deal with the mistreatment of women, both in reference to her relationship with Paz and with the Mexican male establishment, Sandy proves that these texts are not exactly autobiographical. And I quote Sandy, "Garro writes to see herself as both herself and as other whose existence illustrates the problems of living as a woman in 20th century Mexican or European society." End of quote. I wish to end recollecting the past as a way to celebrate the present. It was December of 1985, and I was a graduate student attending the MLA in Washington, D.C., feeling a bit like a ship among wolves. In Spanish, we say cucaracha en baile de gallinas. As I was being interviewed for the job market, I was about to have lunch by myself when I saw Sandy and Ray. I obviously knew who she was. Imagine a graduate student, Sandra Cypess was right there. And because we had seen each other at Cornell, they invited me to sit with them. Well, it was, as the phrase goes, the beginning of a wonderful friendship. This past January, 28 years later, and in another MLA, this time in Boston, we gathered around a table as Sandy chaired a session on Spanish American theater and responded to our presentations with professionalism and kindness. With her characteristic smile, her undiminished enthusiasm like the Energizer Bunny, inexhaustible, giving us her very best, just as she had supported me at every single stage of my career, never expecting anything in return, just simply and generously giving of herself as an example of mentoring and solidarity. I think the session at the Boston MLA was just an excuse to actually continue celebrating our friendship. Thank you.
That's hard to talk.
Yeah.
The Cuban patriot and poet José Martí once wrote, "Not what I wanted, nor what I needed to read. For how long I sighed for a good book on universal history." Close quote. As scholars and professional readers, a good many of us have known this same feeling all too well. How often in our daily work as critics and literary researchers have we not paused to wish that somebody finally would write a book about this or that important subject that seems ripe for study or comprehensive synthesis? Further still, how many times have we not wished to be the person who finally writes that much? Few people have had the privilege or the sagacity or the sheer good fortune of writing such a book at least once, and fewer still have had the joy of writing such a book more than once. One of these happy few is certainly Sandra Cypess. First with her epochal study on La Malinche in Mexican literature, 1991, and now with On Civil Wars, Elena Garro, Octavio Paz, and the Battle for Cultural Memory, Sandy has written much-needed books on two of the most fascinating, frustrating, complex, and iconic female figures in Mexican and probably in Latin American literature and culture as a whole. The word iconic has been much used and abused of late. In the Mexican context, it has most often been applied to the painter Frida Kahlo, who decades after her passing has arguably become more famous and popular than her husband, Diego Rivera. In the field of Mexican literature, Elena Garro has been experiencing a similar rise in esteem. She is certainly very close to becoming an iconic figure of 20th century Mexican letters. Like Kahlo, Garro was the wife of a powerful and influential artist, the poet Octavio Paz, whom she married in 1937, and with whom she maintained a tempestuous relationship even after their divorce in 1959. She was a prolific novelist, playwright, and essayist. Many critics regard her masterpiece, the novel Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, 1963, as a seminal influence on García Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude, 1967. Also, like Kahlo, Garro was combative, prickly, and eccentric, perhaps traits necessary to survive in the male-dominated cultural milieu of mid-20th century Mexico. She refused to be characterized as either a feminist or as a leftist, although she expressed feminist and leftist views at different points in her life, and remained controversial until her death in 1998. All of the facts about Elena Garro summarized above have been known for many years and are documented in interviews with Garro and articles about her by scholars such as Lucía Melgar, Gabriela Mora, and Rebecca Byron. Sandy Cypess's On Civil Wars skillfully collects, synthesizes, and explains these and other materials about Garro, and does so for the first time in the context of Garro's relationship with Octavio Paz. Neither a biography of Garro nor of Paz, although offering plenty of biographical background, this splendid book presents, through contrastive readings of many of Paz and Garro's key works, a portrait of the personal, socio-political, and literary intersections in the work of both writers. Inevitably, this makes for a rather dramatic book, although Sandy wisely hews closer to the intellectual debates between Garro and Paz rather than to the gossipy aspects of their relationship. She underscores instead the drama in their conflicting worldviews, arising in large part from gender differences and from the subordinate role of women in Mexican society in much of the 20th century. The battle of the sexes between Paz and Garro, Sandy observes, was similar to the tense and conflictive male-female relationships between other noted Mexican intellectuals such as Nelly Campobello and Martín Luis Guzmán, Antonieta Rivas Mercado and José Vasconcelos, and Rosario Castellanos and Ricardo Guerra, close quote. Throughout her book's 6 chapters, Sandy is guided by this battle of the sexes metaphor and by the idea that Paz and Garro's differences also involve a struggle for Mexican cultural memory. By the term and concept of cultural memory, Sandy refers to the diverse interpretations of Mexico's history and culture proposed by Mexican intellectuals. Garro and Paz certainly offer clearly opposite views on major issues of Mexico's cultural origins and evolution. In contrast to Paz's The Labyrinths of Solitude, which offers an ahistorical view of La Malinche as an essential paradigm of women's passivity in Mexican society, in her story La Culpa es de los Tlaxcaltecas, Garro argues in favor of the agency of La Malinche in history and for the greater empowerment of Malinche's female counterparts in modern Mexico. Sandy explores similar contrasts regarding Paz and Garro's views of the Mexican Revolution, which both saw as deficient and inconclusive, although Garro's vision, Sandy argues, and I quote, rests on the need to encourage all Mexicans to challenge the belief in a circular, repetitive course of history like that proposed by Paz, close quote. In this regard, Chapter 4 seeks to clarify Garro's equivocal situation after the Tlatelolco massacre in 1968, when, and I quote Sandy again, Garro was singled out in the newspapers as one of the instigators of the student movement, and then, worse, as a key informer against the intellectuals who had supported the student movement. Ironically, she was damned first for having been part of the student movement and then for having betrayed it, close quote. In her detailed and insightful analysis of this sad period in the life of Mexico and of Garro herself, Sandy points out the irony that after Tlatelolco, as in the past, Garro was attacked from both right and left for her outspokenness as both an intellectual and as a woman, while Paz's resignation from his post as Mexico's ambassador to India further exalted his reputation as a critic of the Mexican government and of the hegemonic PRI, Partido Revolucionario Institucional. On Civil Wars is filled with enlightening accounts and observations about the various periods of Garro's life and work. For instance, Chapter 4 also allows readers to understand how Paz and Garro displayed different political views starting from the first moments of their marriage. Perhaps prophetically, their honeymoon trip took them to Spain in the midst of that country's civil war. As Sandy notes, and I quote again, throughout Europe and the Americas, the war in Spain was viewed as the battle between the forces of democracy and fascism, or communism versus fascism. Frankly, this would not seem the venue to choose as the place to bring your new bride, except for an aspiring young poet driven by the romance of mingling with the members of the intellectual leadership in the arts, and perhaps naive about the risks. Despite having lived through the traumas of the Mexican Revolution, Paz and Garro, who married in 1937, immediately set off to a Spain beset by a civil war whose outcome was far from certain. Being in Spain was liberating for Paz and led to progressively more important career choices, while Garro's encounters with the major international literary icons provided disconcerting evidence of the subordinate status of women, close quote. Garro's experiences in Spain during the Civil War, recounted in 1992 in her book Memorias de España, 1937, were eye-opening in terms of her growing awareness of the prevalent role of patriarchal restrictions even among intellectuals who considered themselves progressive and free from social conventions. Sandy observes how Garro's self-presentation as a naive young woman is fundamentally a strategy to separate herself from the political views of Paz and the leftist poets he admired then, such as Pablo Neruda, whom Garro, in contrast to Paz, quickly recognized as a selfish egotist. Yeah, the sharp eye. Garro's critical attitude toward the Spanish Civil War is revealed by several anecdotes Sandy analyzes. A particularly telling one is when, in the middle of a harrowing nighttime drive through the Spanish countryside, in which the car Garro shared with Paz and other Mexican authors was stopped several times by partisan militias, Garro asked, as Sandy says, the difficult question: why do the nationalist soldiers and the Republicans dress the same? To which, after an uncomfortable silence, the car's Spanish driver replied with amazement, "Wait a minute, what a question! Don't you see that we are all Spanish?" As Sandy points out, this was Garro's way of calling attention to the fact that the Civil War was a foolish fight of brother against brother. Furthermore, Sandy remarks on how, in the midst of the overbearing machismo displayed by the male Spaniards and Mexicans alike during the Spanish Civil War, Garro reacts with a hyper-feminine attitude, deliberately going against the grain of the men's patriarchal and ideologically polarized positions. Through the examination of many of Garro's key narrative works, from her novel Los Recuerdos del Porvenir and her short story La culpa es de los Tlaxcaltecas, to the novel Mi Hermanita Magdalena, 1998, Sandy shows that the denunciation of the problems of women vis-a-vis male authority figures is a constant in Garro's textual production throughout her life. Sandy ends her book by remarking on the irony that Paz's views about Mexican politics and culture after 1968 grew closer to those of his ex-wife, even as she became ever more alienated from Mexican life, living in self-imposed exile in Spain. With the passage of time, Sandy notes, social changes have made it possible to better understand Garro's perspective on gender and power relations, thus encouraging the growth of her reputation. Reading Garro and Paz together has allowed Sandy to note Paz's blindness to women's oppression, even as he advocated for human rights and greater civil and intellectual freedoms in Mexico and elsewhere. Similarly, Uncivil Wars gives us an image of Garro that allows us to begin to understand the human frailties behind her self-inflicted wounds after the Tlatelolco events, as well as to appreciate her accomplishments and contributions as one of Mexico's great writers. To conclude, I find it fascinating as well as appropriate that Sandy, as a literary scholar strongly influenced by feminist theory, has written books about talented and outstanding Latin American women, not as lone individuals, but in their relationships with others, and particularly in their relationships with their lovers and spouses. In her works about La Malinche and less prominently Hernán Cortés, and now about Garro and Paz, Sandy writes about two major power couples of Mexican literature, two divinas parejas, to use Aguilar Mora's phrase in his critique of Paz, recalling Sandy's astute observation about other comparable male-female relationships between Mexican intellectuals, Campobello and Guzmán, Rivas and Vasconcelos, Castellanos and Guerra. I wonder if a new and much-needed book by Sandy Cypess about these divine couples in Mexican and Latin American literature can be far behind, or if it isn't already in the works. How about it, Sandy? On Civil Wars, the sequel?
Muchas gracias. Well, what can I say? I'm overwhelmed in a sense, not only to have wonderful friends, and all of you here are included, but also wonderful readers. It is something that you can always hope for, but here I think I have found my wonderful readers. And as a matter of fact, there was an anonymous reader when I sent my manuscript to University of Texas Press, because as you know, everyone, you have to send out your manuscript, and it gets read by these very severe critics. And one of them turned out to be Priscilla Melendez to show her expertise in the field. So I, of course, appreciate all that she said about Garro and putting the book into perspective and taking the point about how important Paz is to this very day. That was actually the reason I started the book. I mean, it is true that it came out of my Malinche. Everything comes out of Malinche. I think that's it, because I realized how misinterpreted she had been, of course. And Garro herself has always been misinterpreted. Many of you who are not in the field know you've heard of Octavio Paz, Nobel Prize winner, certainly an important figure. But when I mention Elena Garro, nobody knew of her. She is really, even in countries outside of Mexico, and there she's not known, from Argentina on up. It's very rare that people have read her work. And so that was my impetus to do this book, in a sense, was to put her in the canon again when I started those many years ago. Because it wasn't a work of 9 months, as my Malinche book was. It took me a long time to write this book because, as you can imagine, all the material about Octavio Paz himself. And the most important thing I did, I guess, was to choose the theme of war, because there could be many themes that one could choose. The theme of love, you know, who knows. But I decided that war was a very appropriate theme, not only, as Anibal pointed out, in a sense, that their own relationship was so conflicted, but in a sense, all the wars that Mexico has been involved in, and they had been so much a part of these, either through personal experiences or in writing. And in a sense, Garro, it seems, has always written more about some of these wars than Paz. and Paz has always been a person who has the grand gesture. I think he is, especially we see that after Tlatelolco, how he renounced his ambassadorship, which seems to be such a hardship, but yet his career took off after that. And as his trajectory went up, hers went down, because until that point she had been known, and she had even won an award for her Los Recuerdos del Porvenir. But from 1968 to 1981, she lived in relative obscurity, and she did not publish one piece of work. And for a writer, that is so difficult. And when I tried to investigate why she wasn't writing, there's where we see the mafia come in, the Mexican mafia, which is why I have to be very careful. My husband suggests I have bodyguards, and today I do. Because from Puerto Rico. From Puerto Rico, exactamente, claro.
There is a long tradition of the boxing.
Yes, right. Macho Camacho, recuerdo, no?
So you're protected.
That's it. Good, I need it, because evidently to say the things I do say about Paz in this book might get me in trouble with some of the Mexican mafia. I do suggest that he was influential in keeping her silent, all those years in publishing. And in a sense, too, I suggest that we have to reconsider what Paz wrote. And in the last chapter, which is the Battle of the Sexes, I do talk about the fact that Octavio Paz is ironically associated with two very important women figures, La Malinche on the one hand, and Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Those are, who's left, right, as really being the iconic women. And in a sense, his attitude towards Malinche is discussed in 2 pages of El Laberinto de la Soledad, 2 pages. And yet I have read critics say the extensive work of Paz on Malinche. But wait a minute, 2 pages. But that's the impact, that's the importance of a figure like Paz. And when it came to Sor Juana, he said almost about himself, no, Sor Juana c'est moi. I said my French. Joe. In a sense, he felt as Baudelaire that he was Sor Juana. And what I suggest is that he is not so much Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. I think the person who is more like Sor Juana is actually Elena Garro. She was beset by the intellectuals of her day, just as Sor Juana was. She was, permitted only a certain amount of publishing. Sor Juana had to stop publishing at a certain point, and just as Elena Garro. And I suggest that perhaps Octavio Paz is more a malinchista in his own definition, because after all, he rejected his Mexican wife, he married a French woman, right, and lived many years afuera, outside of Mexico, and always writes about important universal topics. So I call him a malinchista in this book. So I have a feeling, and I already know that one critic in particular wrote and said that Garro really isn't as important as I try to make her out to be, and that I say things about gender issues that, after all, it's more than that. Why isn't she in the canon? Why isn't she translated more? And the person is saying, well, obviously Paz is so much better. And my point was not to be, as some critics have said, the asesinato de Garro. There is some of the critics who go overboard, the women who write and try to protect her and say there was an assassination of Garro by Paz. And I won't go that far, but I think that we have to not diminish the work of Paz, but certainly to open up the space to say that Garro has contributed, and she has been in dialogue with him in very important ways. And so I open it up to everyone who has no project for the summer to perhaps, translate her work. Because we need only, all his work has been translated into a number of languages. And in English, very few of Garro's works have been translated. Her major book, Los Recuerdos, 2 little novelitas, a couple of plays, and that's it. And yet, she has written perhaps one of the most magnificent short stories, La Culpa es de los Tlaxcaltecas. As Chris always says, at BYU they talk about her as having written one of the best books on the Mexican Revolution, one of the most important short stories, and certainly some of the most important plays. And yet, she isn't known as well as she should be. So that was my goal. And I think with Priscilla and Aníbal, I have completed my goal. However, I'll tell you what happened when I looked up at MLA just now. In the MLA bibliography, my book appears, and the subjects that the MLA decided were important for my book. Okay, you ready? Drama, okay, war, collective memory, national identity, sexual politics, reception, and I certainly do cover all of that. And then finally, Paz Octavio.
Oh.
They don't mention Elena Garro. So I have still more work to do. I may have to write another book on her, perhaps. Isn't that amazing? 2013, my job isn't over. But
The sequel.
it's disheartening, so we have to work at it. And I ask all of you to include her in your courses and to read her work. So now if we have any comments, questions, we'll be happy.
When we wanted to do this, we wanted to have an open conversation.
Yes,
So
please.
please come
And I just wanted to retell an anecdote that we talked about when Pura Lopez came to
Yeah.
present her
Oh,
work
yeah.
with Alistair Reed.
Yeah.
It's a 3-volume poetry reading, bilingual poetry reading, in which they made a selection of the best poetry ever in English and in Spanish, and they translated each other in the language, and it's fantastic. So no poetry by Octavio Paz is included there. Because
Yes, because.
Pura
yeah,
had to
why?
insist to Alistair to include him, and he refused to. And then eventually she convinced him of including one small poem, and they took it to the widow Octavio Paz, and she said, "Oh no, you're including 3 poems by Pacheco, by Jose Emilio Pacheco, and 1 by Octavio Paz? Oh no, please." And we continue to be friends, but take him out. So I think this is a good response to the MLA.
Okay. Can you imagine?
I think, Sandy, we have to take always the long view and all that. This is a process. I mean,
Yes.
it's already ongoing.
Mhm.
There's been definitely a widespread movement to recognize and bring into the canon
Yes.
major women writers who have been marginalized for several reasons.
Mhm.
Garro's case is interesting because, as you yourself point out, I mean, she especially after the Lorco incident,
Yes.
she caused herself some harm.
She did.
It just shows how the pitfalls
Right.
that any woman who wants to be outspoken in this
Yes.
sort of male-dominated environment
Mhm.
in Latin America has to go through, and so that hurt her in some ways because, of course, she was not also a purely leftist figure. She was
Yeah.
a very complex figure, in some cases justifiably bitter, in others. And when you read stories like Los Tlaxcaltecas, which is a brilliant short story, but you also see that her way of saying things can be quite indirect sometimes.
Yes.
Requires deciphering and a greater degree of attention, and while Paz had the megaphone,
Yes,
and,
that's right.
and a penchant for writing in very pithy statements, like politicians with their how do you call them?
Oh, there's
The
sound
Paz
bites.
produced sound bites,
Sí.
but Garro produced
Sí.
complex fables that need to be deciphered. So
Yeah.
I was just going to say that probably 1 month and a half ago, we received at our house from Bucknell University Press a book devoted completely to Garro.
Mhm.
It
Yeah.
just has been
Byron's
published.
book, yeah.
Rebecca
Rebecca
Byron's book.
Byron.
Rebecca
Right,
Byron's
exactly.
book. So
Right.
that is
That's- yeah.
hopefully
Mara
It's an
Garcia
ongoing
has
process.
Catching-
It's going-
catching up.
on.
Yes, and
Yeah.
Mara too. But I think Rebecca's is in English,
In
Yeah.
English,
and
that's
Mara's
right.
in Spanish. So I think we need to encourage, the all the languages. Right. She has been translated into Italian, interestingly enough, Garro, recently. But I don't think in French. I looked. There was nothing that I could find in French. And Persian?
No.
No.
Paz
I don't
has
think
been
so.
translated very widely.
Exactly. Exactly. Quechua, Reggie?
Marginalizations of this kind, Sandy, are not surprising, of course. My question is, and I have examples of that, but because I do Persian, it's even more marginal than
I know.
than women writers,
Sí.
poets. How does it fit within feminist theory? How does your theoretical side assist in demonstrating so powerfully, apparently, this marginalization and the extent of it and the vehemence of it and the violence of it and all of that. Shed some light there. Perhaps those of us who are working outside of Western traditions can take a lesson there, seeing how it is that marginalizations of this kind within a love relationship, nonetheless, operate, and how does the culture then is sucked into how's the culture sucked into buying it for so long until you come around. You've shown your devastating power in New York, I suppose, 6 months ago, but now in the field of scholarship, how does it operate? What light do you have to shed on those of us who work outside of the Spanish, Latin American literatures, but are concerned with marginalizations of this type?
Well, I think the idea of marginalizations is often how you look at it. In a sense, I always like to say that when we talk about the canon, and in English, the canon is such a phallic figure. It's only going in one direction, too. I really like to think of the way we look at all of the literary landscape should be more like a quilt, where at one time you look at one aspect of the quilt, a little pedacitos, little fragments here, and then you could look elsewhere. Because it all depends on what your values are, in a sense, and what you think are important. And in a sense, in Latin American literature, for the longest time, there were only certain ways of reading and certain readers. When you were all male readers, they often said, well, women, are in a chapter apart. I remember the one on Ruth Lamb even writing about Latin American drama, and the women dramatists were in a chapter apart. Las mujeres, little pieces around there. So it's a way how you approach the material. What are your values in looking at it? Do you value the themes that are being presented and saying those themes, yes, are crucial? So I think sometimes the idea is that in a given culture, there are certain values that are presented as being important and others are denigrated. So that you have only the writers who are writing X, the idea of the theme of war, for example, for so long is a theme related to men. Women did not write about war. And it's one of the most important things. I bring that out, that's one of the crucial things of literary, starting with the classics, right? We have...
There's a struggle,
yeah, the struggle, but where's the voice of the women? Women were not supposedly in war. But then there is an opening up of the idea that war is not only on the battlefield. War is brought, especially in the Civil War and the Mexican Revolution, the war was everywhere. There wasn't a particular battlefield. And so women had a relationship to the theme. In Mexico, Nelly Campobello writes about war. But for a long time, her work was ignored. Totally. She took it from the perspective of a child, which again was the idea that was very much like a woman's work. She's dealing with a child. She's dealing with her mother. So those are themes that are not important. Well, why aren't they important? Because they're not masculine themes. So again, I think in marginalizations, it has to do, you have to review who's reading and what are the values that are being, say, presented as important in a culture. Well, I'm sure my colleagues here are many feminists who want to contribute to that idea. Anyone want to add to it? See, Judy. Judy Rumani.
Oh, okay. This doesn't have anything to do with Mexican literature, but their relationship reminds me so much of another literary power couple, Elias Canetti, who wrote in German. His ancestors were from Spain, but he was born in Bulgaria, and his wife, Vesa, short for Venezia Canetti, for a similar background. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and she never won anything. Her books were written mainly in the 1930s. She did a collection of Viennese folk tales, which wasn't very heavyweight, but then she wrote two brilliant books, one called The Tortoises, and the other was called Yellow Street, about Jewish refugees trying to escape from the Holocaust. And they're really brilliant books. They were written, I think, in the 1930s. They weren't published in German until the 1960s. And then about the 1990s, they were translated into English. And her husband was getting all the accolades. And I don't know, after she died around 1960, I think he made sure that her works were finally published, which was very nice.
He was too busy before that. I guess there are so many
Very
examples.
Similar kind of.
Yes, but you're reading them, aren't you, Judy?
I don't read the German.
But you read the
unfortunately,
translation.
in translation.
But it means that someone has to read these books and write about them. And I think that's the idea constantly.
But Sandy, Los Recuerdos del Porvenir is an incredible novel. It's excellent, and it has not been read by many people. And it has been, a lot has been written about it, but still doesn't. It's in a place that it doesn't move as where it should be. And you mentioned, I think Anibal mentioned the influence of this book on Garcia Marquez.
Right.
This book is written in '63, Los Recuerdos, and Garcia Marquez's Cien Años is '67, and he was living in Mexico at the time. And he has acknowledged it, and people don't go to this book and explore it as it deserves to be explored. And
I think it's, again, taking the long view.
Yes.
There's a process going on for now, at this stage of the 21st century, we have definitely a greater participation of women in Latin America in public life and in the culture as a whole. Women who are very eloquent or are writing and very visible, in fact, people like Poniatowska, for example, in Mexico, just to mention one example. And their presence should encourage people to start looking at women's literature. One of whose qualities, I think you mentioned that you were quoting Susan Gubar at some point.
Yeah.
She mentioned, Susan Gubar has remarked about the importance of silence in women's literature. The fact that the literature produced by women historically, for the reasons that we know so well, has always tended towards the subtle and the marginal and the not quite center stage, and for various reasons, and so we have to learn to read that and incorporate that into this sort of quilt-like version of literary history, rather than a more inclusive version, rather than a more exclusive version, as has been the case with canons. Usually, canons. We talk a lot about inclusion in the canon, but most critics like to exclude from the canon.
Yes,
some of the critics that I know, and to have a more inclusive version of the canon that takes into account the type of reading that women writer, at least up to the 20th century, has required. I think now we have women, and a great many, and that's to be celebrated, who are writing head-on, facing head-on some of the big topics that traditionally men used to take on.
Yes, there's no more, a topic that could be considered a woman's topic or a men's topic. It's now whatever a topic, and that's good. But it's interesting about this idea of knowing how to read, because I remember very well, I've written about the fact that Rosario Castellanos' Balún Canan, a novel that was always considered indigenous, an indigenous novel, and really it is so much more a novel that also talks about male-female relations, gender relations in general. And in the novel, there's a young child who's narrator and narrates the first part and the third part. And in the middle is the omniscient narration. And she was criticized by the male writers, the critics of Mexico, for such not having a coherent structure, because she had, this middle part and the narrators. And Castellanos, what was her reaction? She said, "Yes, you're right. I shouldn't have done it that way, but I couldn't do it any other way." And this was at the same time as Carlos Fuentes writing La Muerte de Artemio Cruz, the death of Artemio Cruz, which had 3 different narrations. And an I, a you, and an omniscient. And that was considered wonderful. But hers was not. Now why? So when I read the novel, it seemed to me that what she was doing was actually creating a gap, this brecha, the child, and then the imposition of the authority, and then the child picks up again at the end. So it seemed to me that structure was meaningful. But for certain critics, it was not meaningful. So
the reading is uncomfortable. That's what it is.
It is, too, yeah. Well, she was saying very many uncomfortable things about Mexican society. So it's very hard and very subtle. And I think part of the problem is even, Gabriela Mistral, our view of Gabriela Mistral, an iconic figure, people always talk about her and her maternal poems, But there's many more readings that one could make of Gabriela Mistral. So again, the material is there, and it's just a question of the critics, the readers, and what we see and what we endeavor to continue to publish, to give different views.
But Sandy, one other thing. Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
Go ahead.
On this topic, I simply wanted to put a small interjection in to problematize the notion of the big topic. So let's pause for a moment and consider motherhood as not a big topic.
Right, exactly. Why?
So, and who, when we think about it, and contemplate how these are they decisions or are they not? How are these values created? I think then we're looking at the larger frame of feminist feminine or female marginalization and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. Big topics. Let's see,
I have an observation and a comment, and I think for every book that gets published, several others don't get published, and part of the reason is individual generosity. And Sandy was my dissertation director, and I know how she works with graduate students, and I've always been very touched by that generosity that's lasted for so many years. So thank you for that, and the gift of confidence that you've inspired in so many, yours truly included. The observation that I have, and what I find fascinating about your work, and always have been, and always turn my students onto your work, is that you're really grappling with two of the foundational pillars of literary studies, which is periodicity and canonicity. And all these writers that you're so interested in really don't buy into the idea of canonicity. And that, in part, I think, explains part of the challenge that we have with writers like Garro, like Castellanos, and so many others that have come after. So thank you for so many years of dedication, nonstop.
I wonder if I could add another element to this whole discussion, and that's the idea of orality. In addition to silence, could we posit, because in the Persian and Arabic traditions, you have this archetypal figure of Shahrazad, and the storyteller, the weaver of words, and so on and so forth, and yet the writing is done by men, and the transmission has been done by men, and so she turns into a character in a story that men tell. And so my point is there something in that dichotomy, orality versus the written word, that militates against a greater recognition of writing by female authors? Can you think of a stylistic? You just mentioned the novel with varying roles for narrators and so on and so forth. Is there any merit to saying it is because of the orality with which women, rightly or wrongly, have been associated as mothers, as lullaby singers, and so on and so forth, that kind of makes the genres themselves marginal rather than the content of what they write?
I don't know if they were writing in marginal genres, though.
I think Garro sounds strong. I think she's dealing with things like, for example, Los Recuerdos, with war, with this moment of war, with power struggles within the political arena. So she's not backing off from confronting that and dealing with that in her own terms, but it's still that.
But I think most women were writing in all the genres, right, throughout the years. The people I was interested in were writing. To me, it's always a question of the reader reception. Who is reading and who sees what's in there. There have been so many misreadings. I mean, even the great Quixote. El Curioso Impertinente was considered to be an extraneous part of the novel. Why did it put it in Bernard Herrmann? So, I mean, even Quixote was misread. Shakespeare, at one point in the 18th century, was considered to be a bad writer because he didn't follow the Aristotelian unities. There again, there's the clash between what the critics decide is good and what a writer is doing. So I think that's more like what I would say has been a problem, is that the writing is there and how we deal with it and what we can
that's really
see.
basically my point. Do men read differently than women?
Well, Valerie, what do you think?
Well, what's curious about discussion is that you couldn't even pose the question when I was in graduate school. I mean,
Yeah.
the whole idea of binaries
Yeah.
was antithetical to an
Right.
intellectual enterprise. So it's really curious how the question of canonicity
Right.
reinserts itself into these discussions. And if you're doing it as a way to enter in and out of circuits of power, it's fascinating.
Yeah,
If we
right.
continue to reify these boundaries,
I
then
know.
it's kind of problematic for lots of reasons, which
Yeah,
is
I
so
know.
terrific why you, in your first book, wrote about Chicana reinterpretations of this figure of woman. So.
So I think I should tell my other anecdote.
Oh, yes.
Because
Hold my
when-
breath. Okay.
When I was an undergraduate student taking a class with Beth Miller, who was a professor from Berkeley, who basically produced the first anthology
Yes.
of
Latin
feminist writing in
Yeah.
Latin America. I mean, the first it was in the 70s even. She told us as undergraduates, she tells us that she went to Mexico to interview Octavio Paz and asked him what was his favorite female writers in Mexico, and his answer was, "Are there any?" Here's someone who wants
There
to
you
say
go. Sí. I know. Gracias.
We seem to have entered into the issue of subjectivity. And I think we need to realize that the I, in both the EYE sense and the I as the pronoun sense, is a male I, isn't it? You know, it's not that men don't treat of motherhood, if a boy if an adolescent male growing up is part of the big topic category, but the mother of the boy is not, we really have to reflect on it. And ask ourselves, who is the I?
I was just going to say also, maybe in a brighter note, one aspect that even though Garro, what we've seen to this day, as Sandy was reading about the MLA
Yeah, those
categories, but nothing has stopped Garro's writings to influence other female writers in Mexico, and there are many absolutely excellent Mexican women writers, Boyosa, Barbara Jacobs,
Sí.
Berman, Poniatowska in a later time, you have they have not been able to stop this excellent, really prolific writers in Mexico of continue writing and producing, and so it is hard, but they have done extremely well. Mastretta.
Being popular.
So you still see that against all odds, there's a good, excellent production by women writers in Mexico. So I would say that this is because Garro was writing, even
Yeah,
against all odds,
Right.
and that seed is there, and they have some others to look.
Yeah, Las Madres.
Yeah, and Glantz. I mean, Glantz.
Margot Glantz,
Margot
right, yes,
Glantz.
and which
You
is-
have a core of
Well, it
very
brings-
important.
Right. It brings us back to the whole idea of networking too.
Yeah.
I mean, you need this network, this support system. Certainly faculty, women need that support system, and this, we were talking about that and the importance of that, and the idea that these women writers and critics and publishers willing to publish the work. So I think it's crucial, and certainly Garro herself, when she disassociated from feminism, it was because it was such a bad word in Mexico. It didn't quite mean what we want it to mean today. And she was the kind of person, though, who not only fought for women's rights, but for indigenous rights, too. The Indians were important to her, the campesinos. And so a lot of that, of the actual activism of Garro has been erased from history. So it's both history and literature that have to be rewritten all the time. That's what happens.
Just a general question. You also have written about the Urrutia and the contemporaneos.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, the contemporaneos in their own time, they were basically accused of, not worshiping the testicles of the revolution, like Salvador Novo said.
Sí.
So they were accused of being effeminate,
Yes.
being outcasts,
Yes.
descastados.
Yes.
How do you connect the reaction of these macho mandarins of the Vuelta magazine and Parasitic Circle, which are, I don't know if you agree, they see themselves as the inheritors of the contemporaneos. I don't know. You know about where that
it's...
But have you thought about, is there something there that would sort of explain partly this reaction against
the
what he
contemporaneos?
said about the women in Mexico, there's no women right here?
Well, it's a fascinating story, too, and Garro is part of it. In the chapter on the Spanish Civil War, I talk about this idea. When Garro writes her memoirs about what happened in 1937, she starts the book, and that book has not been published in English, and it really deserves to be translated. She starts off with this very interesting statement, "Yo no conocía Karl Marx." I don't know Karl Marx. And some of the critics say, what does she mean she doesn't know Karl Marx? How stupid, naive. That's why I almost called her at one of my presentations a ditzy blonde. She's performing as a ditzy blonde. She's performing the naive blonde. She does know Karl Marx. But at that point, you have to understand, in the 30s, there was a debate in Mexico about masculine literature and feminine literature. I'm sorry for the binaries, but that was it. That's how they talked about literature. And the contemporaneos were a group of men who, when I was in graduate school, we didn't call them homosexual. We didn't know that. But it was true. They were all involved. They were called effeminate in the sense of they're cosmopolitan, and they were rejected. And Paz, at that time, rejected them in a way, because they were the padres before. They were his forefathers, and so he was trying to distinguish himself from them. Garro, in her memoir, says, I reject Karl Marx. I reject the Marxists, the communists of the 30s, because they're rejecting the contemporaneos. And she says, my heroes are the contemporaneos. So she put herself firmly into the situation of the maligned group at that time. And she says, and she has a very interesting comment about homosexuals in the book, too. It's fascinating. She goes, that why are they being persecuted in a way? She says, what's happening here? Why are they good or bad? She was trying to figure out, she was acting so naive, but in a sense putting into the discourse things that you should talk about and re-examine in your own mind. And she rejects communism because that's where Paz was going to, and that's where all the important intellectuals were in the Spanish Civil War. The lefties who were all there were always communists, and then she finds out you just can't be communist. You have to be a certain kind of communist. You have to, accept Stalin. You can't. Gide rejects Stalinism, and he's malign. And there's all these different partidarios, all these different sides to take. And she comes out on the side of the contemporaneos. It took Paz a long time to come to that realization. He was again involved with Pablo Neruda, who was very, very strongly communist at the time, and he wanted Neruda's largesse. He wanted Neruda's acquiescence to his work, and I even show that the poems that Paz had in the beginning were Neruda-esque. Interesting. I couldn't quote it all in the book because they wouldn't let me. I had to go through so many, as Reggie knows, doing her own book, going through so many steps just to get the copyright. So I couldn't get copyright, so I had to sort of synthesize it. But it was interesting to see how Paz was very much in Neruda's, category, whereas all the time Garro was saying, I'm with the contemporaneos. He comes to that decision much later. Then he evaluates them, and then suddenly they're good guys. But it took years and years, because the debate was that who were the real important writers in Mexico? The machos. And that's when Los de Abajo and Mariano Escuela become known, because that was considered a macho novel. So that's the good novel, whereas the contemporaneos were the bad guys. It was interesting how the binaries worked then. So it was a very exciting time where all of this was taking place, and Garro was commenting, but very subtly, if you call it, saying, I don't know Karl Marx, being subtle, but that's what I think she was saying. Bueno.
I was just going to say one thing. When I started reading the book and the manuscript and everything, I went like, oh, this is daring. She is, and that's something that you said. It's a very daring thing to go, because it's not only being able to analyze and place Garro in a specific context, but to say what she's saying, she needs to know Octavio Paz back and forth. And then that requires, because any attack might come from that.
I have that.
So I thought it was incredibly daring in the best sense of the word, that she came and studied Garro. She could have done it just Garro and said, this is Garro, here we are, you should read it, you should translate it. But it's not only literary analysis, it's the cultural studies aspect to it, and the dialogue. It is a dialogue that Sandy is really pushing us to be part of and engage ourselves with. So no manuscript anymore. It's
yeah, there are some here. They're not there. You know. What are we doing?
Yeah. If anyone's interested in a copy of the book, we don't have tons, but we have these copies here. And if you're interested, you can come talk to me after. We'll see about getting one.
And also, we have a wonderful reception.
Yes,
outside,
please.
so
Let's.
thank you for your
Thank you all.
The attendance sheet, please do.